Hello and welcome to a new episode here on the War of the Rebellion podcast. I'm your host, Niels Eichhorn, and even though it's cold outside where I am, it is way colder where my guest is today. It's not quite at the North Pole, but pretty close, we can say, up there in Finland. And of all things, coming to you from Germany and Finland today, we're going to talk about the Irish.
What else?
Yes. So my guest today is Damian Shiels. He has a PhD from Northumbria University, and we'll have to do a little bit of gossiping here about his PhD dissertation advisor at some point. But we'll leave that to the conversation as it goes. Damien is currently a freelance archaeologist and historian, sort of consulting work, but he has done a number of things with regard to research fellowships, heritage consulting, excavation management, curatorial work, but many of you might know him from Irish Battlefields Project, or it was the Union Blue Jackets pilot project that he also was part of. And today, oh, I should say he also has published quite a bit on Irish in the American Civil War. And that is what we are going to talk about today. A book that came out in April of this year by LSU Press, Green and Blue. Irish Americans in the Union Military, 1861 to 1865. Well, Damien, thank you so much for joining me, and great to finally meet sort of face to face.
Yeah, thanks a million, Niels. It isn't lost on me that we are in Finland and Germany talking about Irish people in America. That is good. And
Yeah,
it is frozen up here. I was just saying there we had to shovel out the snow off our drive today. So winter has come
yep.
to the
We had
north.
snow on Wednesday, and I finally got my winter tires on just in time today.
Long, hard winter. Anyway,
Yeah, so ironically, I don't have a Guinness. I don't think you have a Guinness either. So how did the book start? Where was the origin? How did you come to say, I want to write a book about the Irish regular guys?
well, that's a long story, I suppose. Years ago, I've always worked on in military history and military archaeology has kind of been my specialism for the last 25 years. And I was a curator in the National Museum of Ireland in Dublin when we were doing a big exhibition there 20 years ago now.
Hmm.
One of the galleries was the American Gallery. And when I was working on that, um, the Civil War was obviously a big part of it. So I'd always read a bit about the Civil War, but I read more and more of it. And then I thought, oh, Irish people don't have a clue about the level of involvement. And that led me really to starting this website, IrishAmericanCivilWar.com, to give me something to do in my spare time. And then it took over my life for the last 15 years. And that is pretty much all I do anytime I have. Well, I was working at it full time for a long time, but anytime I have spare time, I work on it. And yeah, I suppose that's the backstory to it, and through then coming upon what I think are a well enough known source now. They weren't when I started going through them, but the pension files, which I started going through around about 2010, and it was fairly apparent that they were, well, and I still would argue, the greatest source on the social lives of ordinary 19th century people in existence anywhere in the world. So yeah, so it's really all the pension files' fault and the National Museum's fault in Ireland.
Oh, well, it's nice when when we can blame somebody there. But you kind of mentioned that the pension files were a really underexplored subject matter. So why is that? I mean, it would considering how much work there has been done on the GAR and sort of it promoting pensions, you would think that pension files have been more explored than what you seem to indicate.
surprised, Niels, for a number of years when I was looking at them in the early years that you weren't seeing more being done on them. And I wasn't sure why it was. Is that you could carry out, like, there's the digitized pension files. There's about 11% of the widow's pension files total
Mm,
has been digitized, which adds up to about 168,000 files. So, there's a lot to be working on if you want to. But I wasn't sure because we've seen we've seen that utterly change now. It must be said in the past, in over the past 15 years. Come Be just won the Pulitzer Prize,
mhm,
like is a book that's a, an absolute fab book that is built around pension files. Um, but it just seems to have taken time for it to
mhm,
happen, and I think it's still, I think the widows' pension files, which are actually the richer
mhm,
in terms of social history, the richer than veterans' files, are still maybe lagging a bit behind. But it is good to see they've become such a kind of a standard use now. I do think they're pretty underexploited outside of African American history, right? So
mm,
they've been used so extensively now and so brilliantly for revealing the lives of particularly formerly enslaved African
mm,
Americans. But really, they do exactly the same, what I would argue are pretty understudied other groups in Civil War history. I would still argue that the immigrants are a very understudied group
mhm,
in Civil War history.
mhm,
And I think that particularly the northern urban working classes are very
mhm,
understudied in Civil War history. And I think they have exactly the same potential for, for all of that sort of work
mhm.
as they've shown for African American studies. But I mean, how long everybody was still talking about the Progress Administration accounts, for example, of formerly enslaved people for up and, as kind of the main, and like the pension files are just blow a lot of that out. I mean, they're still valuable, obviously, but the pension files material is just incredible. And so, anyway, yeah, I, I'm possibly the biggest mouthpiece that you could find in relation to the fantastic nature of these files because I spend my life in them and I've done for quite a long time.
Yeah, and you kind of you use them in so many different ways. You have digitization, you have sort of like I know I've seen like you posting on Facebook like mapping of like where do people widows in Ireland itself are asking for pensions and like you really kind of constructed so many different ways of how we can use them and um like how do you search them? Like, do you have like certain keywords that you're using? Like, is it like very clear that, oh yeah, this guy is Irish, when you look through them?
Well, and I should have said this when you said why did people not use them more, and really this is why they didn't use them more for a long time is because you can't do any of that. You cannot.
Yeah.
You can do a bit of it now on sites like Fall3 mainly because I've tagged a lot of Irish pensions. But when I went through for the work prepare this book, when I started going through it, I physically went through the 168,000 files. So, and the only way, because there is no demarcation
Hmm.
I mean, physically, digitally went through them,
Right. Yeah.
um, because there is no demarcation. So, all you could really do is use things like surname analysis. So if it was an Irish American name,
Mm-hmm.
or if you thought that there was a good chance a
Mm-hmm.
unit had a lot of Irish in it, say they were an urban
Mm-hmm.
Eastern Coast unit or something like that, or obviously an ethnic Green Flag Irish unit. So that's why that took about 8 years to do,
Mm-hmm.
just to try and identify them. But yeah, but as you say, you can do loads of different things. I mean, just before we came on here tonight, I was working on that the American Pensions in Ireland project, which will be a kind of an interactive map soon. And like even when I was working on that, the sheer number of these people in America in Ireland getting American pensions is incredible, and it's showing you whole
Mm-hmm.
swaths of people that aren't often thought about in immigration, like inner city
Mm-hmm.
Dublin, loads
Right.
of pensions. Belfast in Ireland, Presbyterians
Right.
and Church of Ireland, loads of pensions. So it just opens the door completely on these people.
Now, I'm gonna ask, how confident are you that every one that you think is Irish is Irish?
Oh, so the start of it. finding one that you think is Irish is only step one of the process because you have to prove it. Now, I
Hmm.
didn't in the book I was using, unless there's a handful of them where it's just overwhelming evidence, right?
Hmm.
But everybody else had to be proven to be Irish or
Hmm.
the children of Irish immigrants, which was my classification for inclusion, either Irish born or or the children. And so that takes a lot, you're going looking in um, federal census records and all of this sort of stuff. And that's where interesting things come up,
Hmm.
getting ahead a bit. But for example, you see a lot of times in US military records, somebody who is on the military record classified as American born,
Hmm.
who is not, who is Irish born. To
Hmm.
such a degree, actually, that a lot of it does seem like there's a level of intent behind it to downplay the
Hmm.
number of immigrants who are enlisting in the American military. So, you have to show it. You can't just kind of go, "Oh yeah, that guy sounds Irish." It's a lot easier, I'll say this, for the Civil War, for say the
Hmm.
classic Irish Catholic immigrant, because there's not a massive amount of
Hmm.
beyond second generation Irish in America. That Irish Catholic, at that point there are some. You know, I did find a fantastic series of letters from Pennsylvania coal mine region that I were sure were Irish, and they weren't. So, it does happen.
And you were like, oh,
Yeah, I
why?
was. Yeah,
Why?
yeah, yeah. I was so upset about it. I spent ages trying to go, maybe I got it wrong, but no, no, no. The grandparents were born
Oh,
in Pennsylvania. So anyway.
yeah, that's the heartbreaks of a researcher is that you kind
Yeah,
of like you're expecting something and then it doesn't get delivered.
yeah, 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 yeah. It's a constant. But anyway.
So you're doing something very with these pension records, you're doing something very unique in that you're looking at the average Irish guy. And when I read that passage in the book, I kind of was like, and you indicate some of the people that have worked on Irish, right? Like your advisor, the oh now I forget his name, which is
Right.
embarrassing.
He's sent on the Confederates, and then you've got people like Ryan Keating,
Right.
and Susanna Ewell and everyone. Yeah, there's been some fantastic work done on the Irish generally.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but it's sort of like it's very general, and like you say, it's like if we ask the average Civil War buff, Irish Americans in the Civil War, the Irish Brigade pops up, right?
Yeah.
Thomas Francis Mayer pops up, or like like maybe if you dig a little deeper, John Mitchell or some of the other figures, but it's always the Irish American units or the top leader guys or the Fenians. So it's a very small group that we have so far studied.
Yeah, yeah, and the plain and simple reason for it is because outside of the pension files, by and large, these people didn't leave any record behind.
Hmm.
So it is literally the likes of your Mars and the Fenians who are writing all the time, like all the time, because obviously they have a political agenda. I mean,
Hmm.
you study a lot of this stuff.
Right.
So the like they've and then when you look at the ethnic Irish units like the Irish Brigade, they left a big historical record
Hmm.
behind because obviously they were the main representatives. So they
Hmm.
wanted to kind of they were literally the flag bearers for Irish America.
Hmm.
And it has impacted things more broadly. I think even in the broader field of actual people who study the Civil War, it's almost the ethnics more generally are kind of very pigeonholed, I think, rather than being
Hmm.
seen as they haven't broken out. Say African American service now is rightly in recent years there's been a corrective that's shown like the degree to which they contributed towards victory, and it's a lot of stuff on the African American contribution
Hmm.
is kind of broadly studied across the war. I think ethnics are still very pigeonholed. Like, but if you look at the Irish and the Germans, like the United States does not win the American Civil War without the Irish and the German
Yeah.
immigrants. Like it just doesn't happen.
Yeah.
And like there's still, it's kind of, well, let's talk about Chancellorsville with the Germans and maybe the Irish Brigade of Fredericksburg a bit. And it was really trying to break away from that to
Right.
show the degree to which actually, these people are all over the place. And
Hmm.
indeed, I think I was mentioning it earlier that other, I would argue, great understudy group in the North are these urban working class whites. Like
Hmm.
I think the Irish. are the closest we have to almost a proxy group for maybe telling us like what
Mhm.
is ordinary white working class New Yorkers' view
Right.
on the war more generally, because we don't really know that, I would argue, you know. So yeah, they're the lowest of the white level in the north that you get out of these pension files. And you know, I was just saying about that work I'm doing on the pensions being paid in Ireland, like uniformly poor working class areas. Literally a
Mm.
couple of minutes before I came on here, I was mapping Dublin, and it's all the historic, like the Liberties in Dublin, inner city poor people who are getting pensions from the war. Like so, yeah, I've become a major proponent of looking at them for this thing, and my other big takeaway, I think, from the book, maybe one of the things that really blew me away as I looked through the pensions, was the degree to which class is as important as
Mm.
ethnicity when we're thinking about all of this. Like it's
Yeah.
not, it's class is more important. Like it's
Mhm.
just driving everything that these people are doing is their experience day to
Yeah.
day as working class people, wherever they may be.
Yeah, and as you were talking about like the kind of scholarships that's out there, and I was sort of thinking because my dissertation dealt with the German American side more so, but the book obviously has the Irish in it, but it's the same, right? We know a lot about German Karl Schurz or Gustav Kerner or Franz Siegel and um the like, Blanker, but then you might have like some of the kernels that still have
Yeah.
sort of German, but as you go down, yes, we know there's these German regiments, and we might have like one individual that kept a diary in it, but on a whole, we don't really know much about the average German-born soldier in the Civil War.
No, no, no. And I mean that's one of the things. If we take the Irish, like, and well, I hope I showed this in the book, but you see a difference between the Irish officers and the
Hmm.
enlisted men. You
Yeah.
see it, like they
Yeah.
they talk about it themselves, and you can see there's that kind of and so, some of these officers are kind of risen from, if you like, maybe upper working class into it,
Hmm.
but there is a difference between them where they share an ethnicity and they, you know, everybody wants the British out of Ireland and stuff, and they'll all spend money to kind of go to talks about it and things, but they have different priorities generally
Yeah.
than officers do,
Mm.
and so you just have to get at their experience. And you know, if you think about the impediments to say somebody who lived in the middle of New York in the 19th century, like
Right.
the Irish are uniformly living in rented accommodation.
Right.
There was kind of a tradition of doing things like burning your belongings when you kind of moved or someone died because these people didn't
Mm.
have space for much stuff. So
Oh,
a lot of them are illiterate
yeah.
anyway to begin with. And so like you have this whole everything is stacked against them ever leaving a
Hmm.
record. But if somebody died in the war,
Hmm.
there was money to be got. And so it's preserved as a result in the widow's pension files and dependent pension files.
Yeah, no, and but at the same time, we're already kind of like we're kind of like clawing that we want to get to the book. But there's one more thing I kind of because you're talking about class, and I it's been a long time, and I wasn't really into the book, but I think Brian Lasky's book on sort of soldiers did look a little bit at sort of like the average soldier and kind of saying, but even when we look at soldier studies, it's not like we have like a like people look at sort of the breadth of like US like, but it's individuals who leave diaries, not sort of the individuals who die who are in the pension file. So it's probably also then a skewed reality that you have a literate person that can write about it, who leaves a record, whose family preserves it for posterity, and then we have it in an archive to use.
Yeah, no, I actually do think that's a wider problem in civil Civil War history. Now, and there has been like Larry and Foot's Gentleman in the Roughs is a really good example of this,
Mm.
like of getting at the difference in class. And
Hmm.
actually, if you look at Larry and Foot's book, you can see it, even where it's not explicitly said that a lot of people who are often being called the roughs are
Hmm.
Irish American.
Hmm.
Um, but you see it in stuff on punishment in the army and things. But I mean, it's not. We're talking about the ethnics, but yeah, I would particularly the American-born
Hmm.
urban working classes. I don't think really are represented beyond the kind of caricatures of what people who were writing these letters thought about them. that they were all these kind of, people who were running around stabbing each other in the 5 points and then kind of had a couple of years out in the war where they may or may not have got up to no good as well. Um,
But you just destroyed Gangs of New York for the entire
yeah,
audience.
yeah, 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 which is a great show, but very problematic.
Which actually, let's go into that because I made a note about that in the book. I remember it because you talked about a specific New York neighborhood where a lot of your Irish enlisted in the armed army. And I don't remember exactly where it was and which neighborhood, but it was from a specific Irish area that they were all from. And I kind of wondered because it wasn't 5 points and it seemed like there were regional differences based on the origins that you were from in Ireland, where you lived in New York, and then what your economic situation was and how you perceived of your enlistment.
Yeah, well, one of the big things that came out of it, and I suppose without jumping too far ahead, but identity has formed for them before. And you see,
Hmm.
so there's an example I give in the book. It's actually in Corcoran's Irish Legion, the other famous Irish brigade that had a lot of Fenians in it, incidentally. Um, where you have two companies of one of the regiments in that refusing to go anywhere because they were from Buffalo and they were being forced in with guys from New York City and they were all Irish, but they were from Buffalo and they didn't want to be going in and the only way they had to be the only way Corcoran had to go and tell them, okay, listen, we make you the Provost Guard so that you have a bit of kind of a point of honor in the unit to do it. And you see this like it was something that came up particularly when I was doing the original pension file research about the regionality. So like New York is all encompassing. It's really all about New York. New York has double the amount of immigrants of any other place in terms of the Irish, but Philadelphia is a really interesting one because you do see now there's plenty of Ulster people in New York, but you do see an incredible number of Ulster people, people from the northern part of Ireland and of all religions,
Mm,
in Pennsylvania. And that's a long, the Irish diaspora scholars would know all about that. It's a
mm,
long held because of historic links to ports, but
mm,
like they are just completely dominating the units that are
mm,
coming out of Philadelphia, and especially the Irish, like the 69th Pennsylvania Infantry, which a lot of people will know. It was at the Stonewall at Gettysburg against
mm,
Pickett's charge. Like that's an incredibly Ulster dominated unit. And,
mm,
and and you just see it time and again. So you do have all of this, and there is I think it's often friendly rivalry. Sometimes it's not friendly rivalry, but they do maintain their own local Irish identities,
mm,
but they've melded them with local American identities, and that can vary from ward to ward,
mm,
and place to place. The Night Massachusetts Infantry, another ethnic unit, offer a really good example of this as well, where there was a letter I found. I mentioned it in the book. Their colonel was a noted emancipationist, actually,
mm.
Guiney, and the other officers in the unit didn't like him. In fact, they hated him, really, a lot of them. Um, and they were mustering out in 1864 and they were going to have a parade through Boston. And one of these enlisted men in the night Massachusetts is telling his family, do not go to the parade
Mm,
because when it goes through the north end of Boston, that is the place where the officers who don't like Guiney are from, and they're going to attack. Like, and so like, the regiment had just gone through just before they'd mustered out, they'd been annihilated at the Wilderness in Saunders Field, and but like they were still going these kind of fights within the units. That I don't know if you ever heard it, Niels. They always say the first item on the agenda whenever there's Irish people try to set up an organization is to split. It's always number one, is to have an argument. So. That followed
Well,
through the Civil
I
War.
guess that is the story of Ireland in many regards.
It is. It is. It is. Yeah, it
And I
is.
thought it would be breaking out the Guinness or the
Well, there was plenty of
whiskey.
that too. Plenty of that goes on as well.
Yeah. But where I want to go with this is you took us in a good direction, and I kind of like the idea of the identity because obviously in so many regards we in nationalism studies, which I consider myself a part of, we sing of Irish as having a very developed identity by the mid 19th century. Obviously, then you have this massive diaspora as a result of the famine. But it sounded like that when you looked at this specific group of working class Irish, they had a very malleable identity.
You could say that. I wouldn't want to underplay the fact, like, a lot of them are, most of them, in fact, would have seen themselves as intensely proudly Irish, right?
Hmm.
And so their cultural traits and everything they do in America, a lot of that is Irish.
Hmm.
But what you do see is their desire to establish that Irish identity in America as their country, right? That's the kind
Hmm.
of switch that they do. So it's not about, and it's one of the, like, it is overwhelming evidence that comes out when you look across the service. Like, just to touch, like, these people have no intention of going back to Ireland. And
Hmm.
you know, people in all the Irish culture and everything, all the music that comes out of America is always, oh, I want to go back. I want to go back. We were driven out by the British. I want to go back. They do not want to go back. Like, that's the music. Um, and what they want to do, and actually guys are sending money from the front to do this, is transpose their community direct to America. They want to pay for everybody to come out and then reestablish it there. So even when they're talking about, and they reference this all the time, when they're writing home, they always ask about where they're from. Like, how are all the boys from Rochester doing? How are all the boys from Albany doing, or whatever it is? They're always asking about the Irish boys in those places. But it's they're now the Albany Irish or the Rochester Irish. That's the way they see them. There is a level of malleability with it depending on the background, because I think one of the other things we've tended to do is look at them, and I mean, this has been approached by Ryan Keating, does a good job of this as well. But you know, we've tended sometimes to look at them all as if they were just one group, you know,
Hmm.
and they weren't. Like, there was, I made the point in the book, if you emigrated during the famine and you were
Hmm.
5 years old, and
Hmm.
you emigrated during the famine and you were 18 years old, like, there's a
Different.
completely different
Yeah.
experience you have of what ideas you form and have
Hmm.
formed. There's potential evidence that some Irish, if they had grown up in America or been born there, sometimes would try occasionally to
Hmm.
underplay their Irishness because of, you know, problems with nativity. And you
Hmm.
know, we all know Sheridan's. You know, where was Sheridan born? Timothy O'Sullivan, the famous photographer from the Civil War, has a similar thing about whether he was born in Ireland or not. And people kind of could then say, "Oh well, I wasn't born there at all." If that if it was the appropriate venue to do that. But by and large, they're quite strongly Irish, but you see culturally Irish, but you see this embrace. And that was the other thing. You know, we talk about St. Patrick's Day parades and everything
Hmm.
is what we think about when we think about the Irish Civil War. But the Irish who aren't in ethnic regiments are writing home about Thanksgiving, the 4th of July. They're writing home about visiting where Cornwallis surrendered to Washington. They're writing home about the stamp that the revolution was all about. So you're seeing their investment in America as well. And so it's that kind of melded, fused identity that they have developed by the time the war happens.
Hmm. Yeah. And so let's think about the average Irish bloke who's not in an ethnic unit, who is one of maybe 10 guys in a regular regiment. Like what are they, what's your sense was their experience in camp life and in sort of the way his fellow soldiers treated him?
The average experience of a guy in a non-ethnic unit, like if you were out in New York or somewhere, which most of them were, like they were mainly East Cork or East, sorry, they were mainly East Coast um, men. So there's a few different things with that. You see a development, you know, we've often spoken about with the Irish Brigade and things like this overt Irishness of the unit and everything, you know, the green flags and always talking about Ireland non-stop and everything. You don't see that, you won't see that with those guys in these other units. They'll talk about whatever their own specific thing is. So maybe they've enlisted in the 40th Mozart, which is kind of a democratic one. They'll talk about that element of it. They have the same development of pride if they're particularly if they're early war volunteers and they stay in for a couple of years. That kind of esprit de corps that builds is just as much part of their identity as any of the other men in the unit. Okay, so like that shows for me that the ethnic green flag units are doing that because they're ethnic green flag representatives. But the guys who are representing firemen out in New York or whoever it is, if they're Irish in it, they'll have the same. There's a few other things I think that are important to consider with them. What's quite clearly shown is one of the first things that they will do in those units is they will coalesce with other Irish Americans
Hmm.
in the unit. So if you're in, you were saying if there were 10 guys in a company, 10, like they will tend to coalesce together.
Hmm.
They tend to tent together when they
Hmm.
can, mess together. They will get them to write their letters home if one of them is literate. So they form these little micro units, that James McPherson talks about, like that kind of band of brothers,
Hmm.
normally among them. But that doesn't mean that they're not talking with the rest of the unit or anything like that. It's about these kind of circles of
Hmm.
connection. Those guys also have a fairly decent chance that they might be under an officer who's a nativist or a know nothing or doesn't like working class people or doesn't like immigrants,
Hmm.
right? And that happens quite regularly. Um, and it was interesting at how little they actually reference a lot of this when they're writing home. I think because, it was kind of fairly standard practice for them to experience it. But a lot of I think what they experienced in terms of the prejudice they might face was fairly low level. But it seems to mitigate, even with guys who are really, nativist officers, it seems to mitigate through the war if they're seen as good soldiers who stand to it. That's kind of put to one side and they kind of become the regiment then. Um, where that, of course, falls apart is if they are deemed to have done something wrong. Um, and Stephen Ramold has shown this with his book on punishment. The Irish were more likely to be punished than a native-born white person was for the same infraction. And you can see the Irish are assumed to be drinking or assumed to be up to no good when sometimes they're not. So they're walking this line. So, but if
Hmm.
they perform as a good soldier, they kind of have a fairly okay path, and that tends to be their experience. It does flip a bit later in the war, where the Irish become particularly associated with bounty jumping and the kind of I hate the term and mercenary involvement in the Civil War, and a lot of senior officers actually view them as this that they're kind of like particularly bad at doing this, at jumping and not being really committed soldiers, and so some of them have a bad experience again towards the end of the war as a result of that. But I do say this in the book that has to be very strongly offset with it's almost certain that the Irish were more willing to enlist in the late war years than native born white Americans were at that point. So, it's there's balance with it. But that's kind of would have tended to be their experience. I I mention in the book one soldier who served with the 20th Maine, which I doubt needs much introduction to anyone of Little Round Top fame. Um, but there was this guy called Tommy Welsh in it, who was called Uncle Tommy because he was in his 30s. So, an ancient man. But a guy called Theodore Gerrish writes the history of the 20th Maine after the war. And you can see he loved Tommy Welsh, this Irish immigrant. But he writes about him the way you might write about you might see somebody in the North writing about an African American in this period, that
Hmm.
kind of real paternalistic, condescending tone. Um, and you can see in that the kind of there's no doubt when you read Gerish's work, like he loved this guy, but
Right.
there's a kind of he's Irish though. You know what I mean? Behind it. So that was always there for these guys. Um,
Hmm.
but they navigated it and they've they viewed generally by and large
mm,
that it was their duty to do it.
mm,
So, it's an awful lot of what they experience is more or less the same
mm,
as what the other soldiers who aren't Irish
mm.
experience. How I classify it is as kind of the sharp edges are a bit different. They
Mm.
have more challenges than most other soldiers, but by and large, a lot of their experience is similar. It's a bit of a
Yeah.
rambling answer, sorry, Niels.
No, fine. You're fine. On the other hand, I kind of, because we're kind of talking about like the general kind of being a small group in a overwhelmingly native-born unit with potentially your nativist officer. You also kind of very clearly highlight the importance of religion here because a lot of your Irish are Catholic, which is different from the rest of or substantial parts of the American public, and uh, a unit might not have a priest, a Catholic priest available to kind of do regular service or especially in case of mortal injury, more last rites.
Yeah, I almost guaranteed that they wouldn't have one.
Mm,
There were some entire army corps that didn't have any Catholic chaplain or access to them. So it's a major problem for these guys, particularly as they're going into the sharp end. It's of fighting, and
mm,
if they're down south in particular in the early years of the war, dying of disease.
mhm,
The Yeah, so they have to find a way of mitigating it. The Catholic chaplains are famous, and there's been great work done on them, but they do tend to focus, as you'd expect them to do, around lots of ethnic Irish
mhm,
Catholics in things like the Irish Brigade. They're much harder to come by, and so you'll see things like some of the Irish might occasionally go to the services of a non-Catholic minister just to get a bit of
mm,
get a bit of religion. But you see this kind of preparation before they go, and then this exchange with the home front, where just before the Civil War, there'd been was termed the devotional revolution in Ireland, where there was this kind of attempt. Before the famine happened, the Irish were a bit kind of wishy-washy in terms of the actual, you know, you have to go to mass and communion and all this. So
mm,
you see this in the pension files, actually. People not always, sometimes they might be getting married in their home and stuff like that by the priest rather than
mhm,
in the church. There wasn't enough priests before the famine in Ireland. So a lot of these younger men are kind of growing up in this devotional revolution, and there's a lot kind of placed on the traditions of the church. But so what you see them doing and what you see their families doing is, I think the most important element of it for them is the physical sacramentals. So the things that they would
mhm,
wear, like scapulars and things like that, Agnus Dei, rosary beads that
mhm,
they would carry. So it was like a mobile
mhm,
um, access to Catholicism for them. They would do things as well quite regularly, like having masses said, or having their family leave money so masses could be said for them in their home communities. But they make consistent references to these sacramentals, these physical sacramentals
mhm,
that they're carrying around with them on the battlefields and so on. And we know that I made the point in the book, but in 1988 there was quite a famous discovery on the Antietam battlefield of members of the Irish
mhm,
Brigade who had been buried there, and they had loads of this stuff on them,
mhm,
the guys that they dug up there. And so that was one of the ways they mitigated this. It was really problematic though when someone died. It was very problematic not having a priest because you had to have a priest if you're Catholic when you're dying. Um, and you even come across letters from non-Catholic chaplains who were kind of despairing that they weren't able to get anyone for a
mhm,
dying soldier.
mhm,
And you have widows writing saying, did he have the last rites? And guys writing back saying there isn't a priest in the entire corps. So it was an issue. And I think for the most religious, like if you were really devout and wanted access to a Catholic um, a Catholic chaplain, I think it would have influenced the unit that you might select.
mhm,
A lot of guys, of course, didn't think about it till it was too late, and they were looking around for it. But that was kind of the main way in which they cope with that absence of chaplains. That most of the other men serving with them did have access to people of their faith.
mhm. Yeah. I also kind of wondered how much of sort of because a number of these are kind of their intellectual upbringing kind of falls during the famine with sort of the entire trauma that that has on the Irish community at large, but also individually. How much does that kind of help foster sort of a religious kind of not necessarily a revival, but sort of a deepening of spirituality?
That's a very interesting question. Like it's
Sorry.
yeah, I don't know that I don't know the answer to it. Like in terms of the guys that I look at, I think most of them have a well, they obviously have a strong enough belief in God. The degree to which they're actually really religious is quite hard to pin down.
Right.
Because one of the problems you have with it is not really a problem, but it's so intrinsically tied up being a member of the Catholic Church with their community that they're almost indistinguishable. Because the setup during this devotional revolution, so the Catholic parish, of which there loads of them in America have sprung up, is kind of the be all and end all of their life. Like that's everything is organized around that.
Mhm.
And then when they're doing things like even referencing Sundays and Mass and stuff, they're often talking about their families. I heard the bells of a church nearby, and it put me in mind of Father Mooney's bells back in New
Mhm.
York. And it wasn't all about religion. It's
Mhm.
about the family because that
Mhm.
was the day. It was the only day off most of these
Yeah.
guys ever had was Sundays.
Mhm.
So it's just so intrinsic to who they are. It's most of them had a level of faith to do. You don't come across too many of the letters, I'll say this, where you get the impression this guy was absolutely devout. You don't. But again, they're often just about literate, many of these guys. So
Mhm.
the degree to what they're able to actually write is often, they're quite formulaic and stuff. And they'll always say, "I hope this finds you well at present, as this leaves me. Thanks be to God." Like that's all. Every letter starts like that. So, um, yeah, like they're religious, but not like overwhelming. So I think you see similar things to what Peter Carmichael found in his general study of common soldiers more widely, about things like providence and stuff, where they're trying to come up with answers when people are inexplicably, snuffed out on a battlefield all of a sudden, and they try and cope with that. But a, a lot of what you see is in the letters in particular is an effort to try and mitigate for within their community when people are killed. But as I say, this kind of completely bound up Irish American Catholic identity that has kind of already established itself by the point of the Civil War.
Boy, we have a record here today that we have three references to Gettysburg in one podcast. That is unbelievable. I usually don't allow that. Ah, all right. Well, but you mentioned letters, and I think that's a great segue because I found it fascinating how you have like people having to write having to ask others to write letters for them, kind of develop blueprints almost of like, okay, this is sort of the sentences I know that I will always use in my letter. So it's um I think kind of what I want to know here is like letters home or back from family are something very personal to people. And it seems extremely intrusive into sort of a person's private life to have somebody else write that for them.
Yeah, we were talking at the start, Niels, about the different kind of things you can find out in the Widow's files. One of the things I discuss in the book, and I think it's worth mentioning at the outset of this, is you can see. So if you take two men who are both literate, both illiterate, neither of them can write. If one of them joins the army at 18 and another joins the army at 38, the guy who was 18 is significantly more likely to have letters written for him than the guy who is 38 is.
Mhm.
And the argument I make is because even though they're illiterate, letters are flying all over the place, and but they have grown up like the whole postal system had changed utterly in the 1850s, like the open access for people in working class, and obviously they're immigrants as well. So those younger guys have just grown up around letters, like even if they can't read or write them, whereas the older guys haven't. And the reason the older guys don't engage with it as much is because it's exactly what you say it was. You are exposing yourself to somebody else because you may not know what they're writing for you. I have an example that I quote in the book of the guy who is writing the soldier's letter, writing to say you're to ignore what he's asking you to do here because I told him he's not having any more money sent. So like his message isn't getting through, and he doesn't know it isn't getting through. This guy is making decisions for him, and so you're really exposing yourself when you do it, and that's one of the reasons. It's not all the time, but it must be 80 or 90% of the times you see it. It's another ethnic Irishman who is writing the letter for them. Like somebody that they trust implicitly is who they get to do it. And so, like, I mean, that's perfectly understandable, really. But thinking about things that surprise you doing work, though. So I have cases where guys were illiterate, having a letter written for them, sending a letter back home where they know their parents are illiterate as well. And then they might write again, like a handful of days later, going, "Why haven't you written back? You've forgotten me." It's like today. It's like if you sent a text message and nobody replies after 30 seconds. And these guys are no different, like. And you think, would you not give a bit of leeway here? There's a war on. You're down at the front. There was a guy in Louisiana. He writes home and he's going, the other guys are crying about not getting letters, but I wouldn't cry. But still, I'd like to get a letter. And he's writing back to his illiterate mother in New York. And kind of, it's some things don't change that much, but that kind of demand is interesting. The other thing I think it's important for Niels, we think about things like the draft riots in New York and things like that. What you see when you're looking at this illiterate and semi-literate correspondence is in terms of the emotional lives of a soldier and his family, the network of people who were drawn into this. So again, just to take the 5 points as an example, if you're in a crowded tenement with loads of families, a lot of them Irish, a letter arrives, you can't read it. You're going to your next door neighbor. The neighbor on your other side is the one who's writing your replies back. You're reading the letters where neighbors are then getting involved in doing things like hiding a little bit of alcoholic spirits in a package to get down to the soldier. And all of these people then are invested emotionally in the fate of this individual. And if they die, they're all impacted by it. And I think because the Irish American community is so ethnically cohesive and they are the least literate white group in the North, that when you have these hammer blows all the time of death notifications coming back to these urban communities, it can't help but have. I'm not saying it's the reason for things like New York draft riots, but I don't think it's something we've considered before. That sort of thing is going to influence people and their views of what are we given to this war? Like, so a guy dies, it's not just the one person in a small tenement apartment. There might be 5, 6 families in that building are feel the impact of that death.
Yeah, and I think that's because I have followed some of these conversations about like like there's these heated arguments about in the Civil War history community at conferences of like, is it trauma, is it PTSD, what do we call what the soldiers experience and come back with that psychological damage, but it's also for the home communities that have that damage
Yeah,
when
yeah.
they have losses like that, and um they especially then if like the last rites were not administered in sayings or
Can I just give you? I've often meant to write about it, but it was one of the things you talk about that. One of the things I've often meant to write about. One of the first times I realized the impact that these type of events were having on the Irish American community relates to Second Bull Run. Some people call it Second
Mhm.
Manassas, but I always call it Second Bull Run. And when I was going through those letters, like there's no ethnic Irish regiment. There are some, but none massively engaged there. But the railroad cut there, a lot of the fighting along there is urban New York City units, and I came across so many. I was thinking I am going to have to do something. I still must do something with it, but I never forget. they were pushed back off there so fast that most people who died in that attack, their bodies, people didn't even see them fall, right? So normally, if you were applying for a pension afterwards, the guy would say, "Oh, I was standing beside him and I saw him fall. I saw his body on the field." At Second Bull Run, the retreat is so fast that they don't have that. And you see this swathe of Irish American pension files where it's often taken a widow like 3, 4, 5 years to get the pension approved because there's no body, but it's just Second Bull Run, Second Bull Run, Second Bull Run. And you're seeing it early in the war. Williamsburg, a battle a lot of people don't think about very much, in May 1862. Like you want to see the impact that has. The Excelsior Brigade from New York out of there gets an awful doing at that. And Williamsburg has just these notifications pouring into Irish America. And like, and you can see they're all close to each other and everything. So like that, again, battles that you never think about in relation to the Irish, but already like bang, 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 it's just having this massive negative impact on them the whole time. And this is beyond the actual real impact it's having on them economically, which we'll probably get into. But
Well, if we have time. We'll have to see here.
yeah, yeah,
We're almost been talking for an hour here.
yeah, yeah,
But the parts that I found fascinating there too, because we do have to talk about like why they enlist, and like that has been a debate in like in so many ways with James McPherson, Darren Sheehan Dean, and even like James Bromal and Pete Carmichael having talked about like the reasoning of why soldiers go and are willing to do this. And you offer a very practical reason of why these working class Irish decide they're gonna join up.
yeah. I'd say this. I think there has been too much of a focus on ideology
Mhm,
generally, particularly in the early war. So you will see, for example, it said that none of the guys in 1861 or 1862 joined up for money because they were getting less money. That's not true. The Irish letters are telling you that it's not true because they're saying, "I have no work," and we know this that the North is goes into massive recession just before the war, and it's loads of Irish American communities, like the jobs that Irish Americans are at that get impacted. So economics is an enormous factor, right?
mhm,
And it's enormous throughout the war. I argue in the book that it actually mitigates somewhat what early war Irish volunteers, how they view later war Irish volunteers,
mhm,
because they have an understanding of the economic necessities of the
mhm,
community that they come from. Um, it is though very important to say there's never a single reason why anyone enlists, and the other one that matches economics is, I think the best way you could phrase it is duty. It's duty to the United States. It's patriotism, for the want of another word. But the Irish don't write letters about. I mean, you can't write back to your wife who might be thrown out of her apartment because you're in the army and not getting paid and say, well, we all have to make sacrifices for the nation. Like that doesn't, you can't do that. You can't do it. And that's one of the biggest things. And I would hazard that a lot of working class people, no matter if they were ethnic or you just can't do that.
mhm,
People's lives are at stake. Um, but you see this kind of just this sense, we have to do it. I'm going to
mhm,
stay in uniform until the war is over and not before. You have guys who were getting off the boat in 1858 and 1859. Whenever they talk about their country, my country, it's always the United
mhm,
States. From the second they get there, they're
yeah,
committed to the United States. And so it's this kind of melding of
mhm,
the two are like I don't think any other motivations, if you like, come anywhere close to those two primary ones in relation to the Irish. Because again, it's one of the arguments I make in the book. Like the Irish for many years have been said to have been underrepresented in the United States military, and they were not. They were
mhm,
overrepresented in the United States military. But there was plenty of reasons why you would think they wouldn't enlist.
mhm.
They don't like African Americans, they don't like the Republicans. How do you explain it? And it has to be, it's those two things. It's economics and patriotism, and often they combine it at the exact right moment for them to enlist.
Well, you mentioned too that there's a lot of things we can talk about here with regards to some money, but you also kind of mentioned that it's very common for Irish during economic crises to enlist, and you kind of bring up that during the famine, a lot of them enroll in the British Army, and it sort of reminded me of Patrick Clayburn a little bit because he did the same thing before and then his unit, I think, was supposed to go to Bengal, but then stays back, and he tried to get
That's
out
right.
of it, and so
Yeah.
it's a very common thing too
It,
of like,
it's the outlet valve, and it's the
hmm
reason. So the British Army is dominated by Irish for much of the 19th
hmm
century. The Catholic Irish are officially allowed to join the British Army from around about the 1790s. They were in it before that, but officially. And they join in droves, and they take that with them to America. And it's the reason that there are more Irish-born than
hmm
American-born men inside Fort Sumter in 1861.
right.
And when it once again is unacceptable to be a soldier in America, i.e., after 1865, and you look at I'm doing a lot of work on this at the minute, the U.S. regular army in the West,
Mhm.
like they're everywhere in it, and it's
Right.
exactly the same. It's the outlet valve. So it's where for somebody in a different societal group in the North, you might go, oh well, I'm not joining the army. Whatever I do, the Irish don't do that. They'll say, yeah, I'll join the army. Like that,
Yeah.
it's just an acceptable outlet, and they do it all through the 19th century, um, and so it makes it an easy choice for them to do it. And as I say,
Mm.
that gangs of New York scene that we were referencing gangs of New York. There's a scene in that where they kind of have all these Irish lads not having a clue what's going on, being forced into the army when they get off the boat. Like the Irish were coming over from Ireland in their thousands to enlist in the U.S. Army because of the opportunities it was given and directly from the country. Like there's no question of it.
Yeah, well, let's make sure we leave stuff for people to discover in the book too. But
Yes,
the
yes.
the the part that I really also found fascinating was sort of the argumentation of like the class of and enlistment, but then you very clearly point out too that a lot of the guys that are in the army say don't enlist.
Yeah, 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 yeah. And that's to do with the economic risk, really,
hmm
because well, number one, they don't like being treated like what they call it, like dogs or like slaves, quite often. But they are aware of the economic precarity that they're in. So for example, guys might desert if one of their brothers gets killed because they're worried that their parents can't look after the farm on their own. Everywhere you look in relation to the Irish, the practical overrides the ideological. Everywhere. It always does because they're living on the margins. And so that's kind of the key element, I think, of their experience, the enlisted men's experience is that.
hmm Um, yeah, well, that was short.
Yes.
I was like expecting you to talk for a minute longer.
Yeah, yeah, sorry. Sorry.
Well, then, let's segues that over to other misconceptions about the Irish, because I mean, I know your advisor, David Gleason, somewhat well. I have watched him at conferences. He does like his rugby, his soccer, and his beer.
He does. All good Irish traits.
Yeah. So
And Tipperary, his home county in hurling.
I guess the first question in that is how many times did you have to go out with him drinking before you could do anything on your dissertation?
Oh, well, we had met before, which was mainly the reason I went. We had very good compatibility on both sporting and enjoyment of pub. So it was very good compatibility, apart from being an excellent historian.
There we go.
Before,
Good.
yeah, yeah, yeah. We actually
Well,
we were bouncing around the Kennesaw battlefield in Georgia shortly after we first met, actually, which is
well,
wasn't in
that's a
Ireland
good
at all.
story.
Yeah, yeah. I had to
So what
fly
was
out
going
later that
to?
day as well. It was it was an
It must have
interesting
been a
couple of days.
Southern, huh?
No, we were at a an Irish Ulster Irish conference actually up in
Oh,
Athens, Georgia. Yeah, yeah.
okay.
On the way back. So we happened to be going back past Kennesaw on the 150th anniversary of Kennesaw Mountain. So we said let's
Goodness
walk
gods,
around.
that would have been like 2014.
Yeah, yeah. Because so myself and David had met I'd been in correspondence for a few years before that, and then but that was the first time we physically met, and that was when I started going, oh, maybe I should do the letters in a
Gosh,
PhD.
I wish I had
So,
known that because I was in Georgia at that time already too.
oh, really? It was, we
Since
did
I
a
was
rather
like,
crazy full walk along Kennesaw Mountain, and then me getting on a plane back to Ireland that evening, which probably wasn't a good idea. It
oh,
was very hot. Anyway, It was good. Memorable
Oh, you did
stuff.
it in the summer. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
I probably wasn't in Europe researching at that time.
yeah. It was.
Um, or actually, that was
That's
about
the
the.
that's the big question that I don't answer in the
Go ahead.
is the weather, how they survive the weather in those places.
Uh,
How you can survive the weather in Georgia and places, I don't know.
yeah, we're not going there. That's that's
Yeah,
a
no,
topic for another
no,
conversation.
no. It
Uh,
is. It is.
alcohol is a big one with regard to the Irish. So let's talk alcohol and issues that you guys faced in regard to alcohol consumption, overconsumption.
Yeah, so I mean, it's one of the big ones is that the Irish drink too much consistently, right? And it was, again, if you go back to the pension files, like there's no two ways about it. There is a problem with alcohol. It's a big release for a lot of these people. There's a big cultural component, as you know, like the Germans and the Irish were getting an awful lot of hassle because of their cultural associations with alcohol. But everybody was drinking quite a lot. There's a massive class dimension to the way it's portrayed in the army and the way it's viewed. And one of the things you see the working classes do in this period is what they would call a spree. So they would go on a spree. So they mightn't drink for ages, but then they have a day off or whatever, and they go crazy, right? As we'd say in Ireland, they go on the lash on a tear.
Ah,
And but so you see these sprees and things happening that can kind of be chaotic, and but then it goes back to kind of normal. But when you look at their correspondence, you can see that they have a similar attitude. And I'm talking about the majority here to most other kind of normal groups in this period that they see overindulgence like consistently as a problem. So they don't have a problem if you're having a few Guinness while playing music by the fire, or if when you get paid once a month you go on the absolute tear for 24 hours. Most of them don't have a problem with that, right? So but if it's impacting you or your family negatively, they're that same kind of masculine idea of manhood that a lot of people had, that you have to look after them. And so you do see some of them saying, I need to kind of get a grip of myself here. Some of them actually joined the army for that reason. But simply put, when you look at their correspondence, there wasn't much drink about. Like they couldn't access it for
mm.
large periods. So, but it's that reputation thing that they consistently have. So, it's grand if you have a kind of a Boston Brahmin sitting in his tent who's completely blethered, but it's a different scenario if the enlisted private from New York, Irish American is they're going to get treated differently. So as with most of those negative stereotypes, it's overplayed the degree to which it was an actual major problem. It was largely a cultural and class difference in the way alcohol was engaged with that you see.
And I would assume nativism plays into that as well because of the kind of
Oh,
attitude that
enormously.
even
Enormously it does.
yeah,
Yeah.
you
Yeah,
can keep
no
going if you
question of
like.
it. No question of it. Yeah, no. All of this, I mean, it goes even further than this that I think we haven't considered as historians even too much. The degree of nativism, like in my view, and I've made some reference to it in notes in the book. In
Hmm.
my view, it impacted the records that were created about the United
Hmm.
States Army after the war.
Hmm.
Like, if you look at guys, Fry, for example, is one of those responsible for it. He talks about it's all the Irish and the Germans and the immigrants are all these guys who are deserting.
Hmm.
Um, you look at the way the records are being kept in the late war, and they say things like, "Oh, towards the late war, we didn't put down where people were born; we
Hmm.
put down where they were representing," which is
Yeah.
an effort to
Hmm.
undermine the number of immigrants. And like I actually there's something, for example, I must explore something very odd going on with Massachusetts in terms of the numbers they have that I think actually is probably nativism. It's
Hmm.
very difficult to prove it, but the official figures from Massachusetts just do not match the numbers of Irish you get out of Massachusetts. When you kind of, for the want of a better term, anecdotally going through the files, but they do have a lower level than when you look at the official figures. So I think we don't consider enough how nativism actually impacts the record that we use to discuss the war and things, say like how many Irish fought in the war. We need to start considering that because it's all at play when this stuff is being created.
Oh. Huh. Now there's a dissertation for you to write.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
That would be something crazy to do. So I
Yeah,
did kind of
yeah.
smile when you talked about like the Irish and sort of the kind of drinking sprees that they go on, and it almost sounds like okay, the best day to fight the Irish is on a day when they just got paid and go on a drinking spree.
Yeah, what most of them did. The army got very bad at paying them on
Mm.
time, but the flip side of it is when they did pay them if they were anywhere near. And I mean, this isn't just Irish. This is just the
Yeah,
men
everyone.
generally. These guys were all legging it off to the nearest town to drink. So yeah, it was a huge problem for the army in keeping effectiveness. They were much better off when they were out in the middle of the field somewhere, on campaign than they were when they were in camp.
Yeah. Um, was it in your book that I think you had a comment about mayor at Fredericksburg actually being drunk too?
That wasn't in mine.
Okay.
but
Uh,
that sounds that's
Where did I
oh
read
sorry,
that?
oh sorry about Mar. Yes, sorry. Absolutely, it was in my book. Sorry,
All
you're
right.
right.
I thought that was in. I haven't
It,
read much else.
it is. Well, actually, on him now, it's one of the most interesting. Because he did have a drinking problem. There's no question about it. Whether it impacted him on battlefields, but um,
So you
uh,
think that he was drunk when he went overboard into the Missouri?
I I don't know that. I don't know.
I
He
might have to put you and
definitely.
Miss
I
Janet
I
Drella into the room and argues that out.
yeah, it's a bit it, it, it it's a bit tangential, but I don't think people have looked enough at the impact of what the Irish Brigades fighting on the peninsula does to Mar in the summer of '62. It kind of gets forgotten
Hmm.
about.
Oh
I
yeah.
think it has a fairly dramatic impact on him
Hmm.
in terms of how he copes with things.
Yeah.
But that's actually from William MacArthur. William MacArthur was his loyal clerk
Hmm.
during and he stops him from falling into a fire. But you see some of the members of the Irish Brigade, and it's really interesting because they never, ever, ever publicly anywhere say anything bad about Mar, right? They just don't do it because they know that they're representing Irish America and that and they love Mar as well, but they know that they're representing it. But there's a letter from one guy there who's wondering why the chaplain that he loves has been thrown. Yeah, I think he was imprisoned for by Mar, and he said, I wonder, is it one of his drunken freaks? And when Mar visits Corcoran in the Legion, one of the privates is writing back saying, "I suppose there wasn't a dry lip in the tent." So like you're seeing, well, number one, the officers can drink and we can't, and
Hmm.
and two, like that it was like there was certainly that culture among the Irish officers. So, um, but yeah, no, sorry, I don't think I haven't seen strong enough evidence to state Mar was ever drunk on a battlefield. And it's difficult to unpick the nativism as well. Like Michael Corcoran, who dies um, in 1863 from a fall from his horse. Corcoran shoots Kimball, who's the lieutenant colonel of the 9th New York State Militia, and they all go mad about about Corcoran shooting him. Um, but Corcoran shot him because and this is in the contemporary letters as well. Kimball said, "I am not letting it given my pass to an Irish
Hmm.
XXXXX," and
Yeah.
that's what he says to him. So like nativism plays a role in Corcoran shooting Kimball there,
Right.
and it plays a role in the way Mar is portrayed by guys who don't
Hmm.
like him as well.
Right.
But
It,
um,
now, one thing, since I have an Irishman on the podcast for a change, how do you get from the spelling of his name to pronouncing it Mar?
oh yeah, I know. Yeah,
The first few years that I studied him, I constantly mispronounced him until I was corrected after I gave a speech in front of 200 people mispronouncing him.
yeah, it's actually what you'd often see a name. Well, it's a different name, but it's often Maher Maher. Like and you can pronounce it that way as well. A lot of it is all kind of coming back from the original Irish and things like that. But yeah, he's always a tricky one with having that about the letters in his name. Yeah.
Yeah.
That are unnecessary.
Well, yeah. Like half the name is silent with him.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah.
Um, so I don't want to overstretch us but I we have covered most of your book except the start,
Yeah.
which is kind of like it seems like more and more that I do the podcast that happens. So as we go to the end, let's look at the start and kind of tell us a little bit about who are the guys that you actually study in the book, because we kind of hinted at it here and there, and that they're working class, but we never really kind of dove into like who are they? What did they do?
Yeah. So it's based off what effectively a regiment strength of letters from different guys. That all the letters come from every state and territory that sent troops to the front end from the Navy. And I suppose their biggest defining feature is that 98% of them are enlisted men, right? So
Hmm. Yeah.
they're all enlisted working class men. They are all working either in if you, that what we term unskilled labor jobs
Hmm.
are working as artisans at the higher levels of kind of their scale is what most of them are doing. One of the things that you notice again from the files is that you're almost on a fool's errand in defining all of this, of course, because they're
Hmm.
moving up and down these scales all the time, where a guy will be a carpenter one day and a laborer the
Hmm.
next and things. So consistently moving up and down.
So would that
There,
indicate they're like day laborers, or do they have like I
there,
seem to
it's
remember on the 5 points I read a book about it, and it's sort of like some of them have like seasonal careers or seasonal work.
yeah. And it can vary. Yeah. So some of them are just hanging around waiting to get
Hmm.
work in different places, and they can go away and do stuff, which they would have done in Ireland as well, for example, during harvest or whatever.
Hmm.
But yeah, like there is an indication actually that sometimes guys said what they could do rather than what they were doing. So they might say I am a carpenter, but they might not be a carpenter actually when they enlist. They might be working taking bags in a hotel. You see this constantly, and I think it's quite interesting for again how we frame when we're looking at people. Like this stuff is very malleable. Um, so like it's that range, and they move up and down that scale quite frequently of their level within the working class areas. Overwhelmingly, what it does, because I managed to get a wide enough view of it, it tells us a lot about where they're living and where they're serving and coming from to serve, right? So, as I was mentioning at the outset, like they're over double from New York than the next biggest. And the next biggest is Philly. It's in Philly, in Pennsylvania. And like the two of them are way up, but New York is overwhelmingly the largest. And when you add in Brooklyn and Jersey to that, it's the be all and end all almost of the entire experience. But they are spread across all the areas where the Irish congregate, so all the urban centres where there are Irish communities are contributing. And the Irish, even though they're from rural areas in Ireland, are urban when they go by overwhelmingly urban when they go to the
And it
United
doesn't sound
States.
like we're talking like it sounds like this is laborers in the cities that do different kinds of jobs rather than sort of it doesn't sound like a industrial working class in sort of a kind of
Yeah, there's been some
textile
very
mill town
I,
setting.
there is a lot of the Massachusetts guys now. If you look at them, are
Hmm.
working in
Yeah,
the leather,
no.
for example. Yeah, exactly, and textile and things. So there's a lot of that. A lot of factory work and things
Hmm.
is going on. But then they are controlling certain kind of jobs as well.
Hmm.
A lot of stevedores, for example. Tyler Ambinder's done a very good recent book on this, where he's actually shown in some areas of New York where people from the exact same locality in Ireland are controlling the entire operation of one sort of like I think he has examples of all these peddlers from County Tyrone in Ireland, like
Hmm.
where so you can see this kind of community-based control, and so they do dominate some artisan classes as well. But and then you have guys working on things like Central Park and everything. So it's very much. a bit of everything where they can get it. Um, but that concentration and focus in these urban and usually highly concentrated within specific wards of these
Mhm.
cities in large part, of course, has a big impact on where they then fight because they
Mhm.
are significantly more represented in the
Mhm.
Eastern theater of the war than the West because the numbers are just so much bigger than they are in Chicago and Cincinnati and St. Louis and stuff. So
Mhm.
you're seeing more of it. But you also see the kind of intergenerational stuff as well. So a lot of the Irish who end up fighting, say in Illinois regiments and stuff, you can see how they've moved from the East Coast. They've moved out of New York families to the East Coast and stuff. So you're getting that kind of movement as well. But that's where they by and large are from. Um, we should say as well how I classify who these men are is based on them being born in Ireland or being the children of Irish immigrant parents, which is important because of that cohesiveness we were just talking about. These guys, and again, you can see it in their letters, are viewed and see themselves as Irish American or American Irish, as I call them in the book. And that adds another 70,000 of these guys. And so when people are looking at their Civil War rosters and they go, this guy's, and I see this all the time, this guy was English, this guy was Canadian, this guy was Scottish. And I'm looking at them going, oh no, that guy's Irish. Like they're just born in those communities. And so this kind of movement that the Irish have all over that area massively impacts their broader numbers in the service.
Well, that's like I remember like there's a large group of Irish that escapes a famine to Liverpool, Manchester,
Oh yeah.
Lancashire, and
Yeah,
then
yeah.
move off again from there. So it's like they might come from Britain, but they're not British.
If you look at the pension files that are paid out in Britain in the later 19th
Hmm.
century, the numbers of Irish there is absolutely staggering, like huge
Okay.
numbers.
Yeah.
I never worked out what sort of percentage, but it's a decent percentage. It's a
Hmm.
big block of
Hmm.
of of British pensions are Irish, and the same is true of Canadian.
Yeah. Uh, you did mention something that we totally never talked about. The Navy. You do have some guys
Mm.
that are going into the Navy too.
Oh yeah, yeah. There's an enormous amount in the Navy. Um, yeah, around about 20% of the Union Navy at the start of the war, through the war, is Irish born, estimated.
Hmm.
So it's probably up then around 30% when you include Irish Americans. They band together on the boats the same
Hmm.
way as they do in units. Like it's a similar sort of scenario. Um, yeah, you might be interested in this. It's just something I've been working on for some part of the Civil War Blue Jackets and some other naval work I'm doing. It's quite interesting. They are proportionately, I think, more likely to return to Europe than guys who serve in the army.
Oh,
They-
okay. That's
you get a
interesting.
yeah, you get a higher proportion of naval pensions than you should. I
Hmm.
think I think it might actually. The Germany is a bit odd. The German states are a bit strange in terms of the navy, actually. But for most of the other places, I think across Britain and Ireland, you see it because I think there's a lot of merchant marine who
Hmm.
are intentionally enlisting and then
Right.
heading away back. But so you have this kind of you have the kind of old sea dog
Hmm.
characters, and then you have people. There's an awful lot of Irish, for example, are oyster fishermen
Hmm.
out of Philadelphia and stuff, and they're all enlisting. So yeah, you have this dominance, and the Navy, by the way, were not counted in the historical figures that we use for how many Irish served. They were excluded, as were the regular army. And if you exclude the United States regulars in the Navy, like you're dropping tens of thousands of Irish guys off your list. So,
Hmm. Skewing the numbers, skewing the
yeah,
numbers.
exactly, exactly.
Just don't give the Irish any kind of, which is kind of weird that when you look at the United States and it's like the two sort of ethnic holidays that are greatly celebrated today, right? Cinco de Mayo
Yeah,
and St. Patrick's Day.
yeah,
Like I
yeah,
can't tell you, like every year my wife was like, corned beef and cabbage. We have to do that on St. Patrick's Day. And every year I kind of was like, I don't want corned beef. I don't like it.
You just wanted the Guinness, Nils.
I don't drink.
You can
I
get,
taste the cabbage.
but they have non-alcoholic Guinness now, so you can enjoy that too. I
Uh,
don't drink Guinness either, actually. So anyway, I
oh,
shouldn't be. I shouldn't be promoting them.
Yeah, we I should probably say that there is no paid promotion of any type of sort in from Guinness breweries involved in this recording. All right, let's make a final question here. So we're at an hour and 20 minutes almost here. So I think one of the biggest pieces that I kind of took away from your book was that uh class really matters and that your approach to how we can study Irishmen without a written record that they left, except for the pension files, can function as a blueprint of how we should study other groups and people that served in the US military.
I couldn't stress enough how much that would be what I would like people to take away from it. It's a big thing. Yeah, I've been doing it with Finnish guys in the
Mm,
Civil War at the moment to look at it. They're all Navy, but
mm,
the like it's an enormous potential. I've looked at Scots in the past
mm,
as well in a similar vein because it gets you to that level, but not but beneath the people who are writing lovely letters and then
mhm.
they're getting deposited in a nice archive, you know. So the
Yeah.
and not that they're not valuable like they are. And there is, of course, there is so many letters around there, but you know, I've seen it in the pension files. You get a lot of letters in
Mhm.
Swedish and German. I've
Mm.
actually a set of letters in German written from the Irish Brigade. If I've still never been able to get translated, might give them to you, Neil, so you
No,
can look at them.
send them over.
Yeah, yeah.
I'll
But
take a look.
it does offer all of that, I think, and
Mm,
like it's just about identifying them, right? So
mhm.
if you're looking for New York working class group. How do you go about identifying them? That's the challenge. You know,
Right.
what do you go to the census? Are you looking at specific units? That's where
Mm,
groups like the Irish and the ethnics are actually useful because you can
mm.
identify the Irish as a group and
Right.
you can say, well, I know most of them are going to be working class. What are they
Mhm,
like? And then you extract them. But
mhm,
it is a huge potential because you're seeing the circumstances that they're coming from in
mhm,
all the affidavits and statements left behind, where people are saying this was their job, this is where
mhm,
they lived, this was
mhm,
their family, this was the condition they were in, etc., etc. And so it's an enormous potential, I think.
mhm,
And using the blueprint, if you like, of all the great work that's been done,
mhm,
the African Americans, to just start expanding it
mhm,
beyond the kind of what I often call like we know a lot about kind of the Ohio farm boys and stuff of the war and the officers like and there's lots of
Yeah.
them, you know, but we do need to get it, particularly these urban people, I think an awful lot more,
Mhm.
the urban immigrants and urban non-immigrants alike.
As I was thinking about the question and asking it, something else popped to my mind. So I'm doing what I usually criticize Andrew Hauk for when he comes on, and it's like final question and like final question. So final question here now. That I think there also was a great irony in this, right? That you gave voice to people with this book who died in the war and whose family members had to give voice to them, and then you're giving voice to them again.
Yeah, it's a fundamentally really depressingly sad story.
Yeah,
Their letters literally only survived because they didn't.
yeah.
Like, you know, they there's an effort to prove connection by handing these letters in. And
Hmm.
it might have been easier for some families than it might be kind of today to give over them, but I don't think it was much easier, if at all. They had to give up this correspondence, and they never thought anybody would be reading it, of course. But beyond who, beyond probably the couple of dozen people who heard it read when they were first read. But yeah, and so at the end of the book, I do have biographies of short little biographies of a lot of these guys so people can find out what happened to them. But it's not, yeah, it's not a nice story. They, you know, and just you're kind of left in those files always with then the trauma of the families afterwards. You know, we're talking about it like of just they kind of, and sometimes they have years of battling for a pension because, you know, we talk African Americans struggled to get pensions because of racism. Working class people often struggle to get them as well because of anti-immigrant and class issues. You know, kind of poor ignorant woman is an oft-quoted line in Irish American pension files. So yeah, it's their sacrifice though has given, as I was saying at the start, this window into Irish people. There's nothing in Ireland like it. There's nothing anywhere else that exists to the same degree because of what the United States did in terms of making these payments after the war. The degree of information we've been left is staggering. And I'm still staggered 15 years later every time I look at a new file. Like I was looking at one there a little while ago, and you're going, wow. And I've looked at so many of them now, but it never gets old. But anyway.
I'm still processing that you have Finns. I mean, it's that you have Finnish people
Yeah,
in
yeah,
there.
yeah, yeah. We have the same number of Finns in the Union Navy as were enumerated on the 1860 census for the United States. There you go.
Well, at least that makes things easy.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, none of them were in the United States, so
Yeah,
but yeah, I mean, there's most European countries, I think, that have any immigration. There's significant things to be learned out of these files. They're from systematically looking through them
right.
because it's just revealing so much information about people.
Mm, amazing. Amazing. Well, at this stage, I think we covered the book fairly well, and we have left enough there for people to kind of find out on their own when they want to read it. So if you're interested in Damian's book, it's Green and Blue, Irish Americans in the Union Military, 1861 to 1865, coming out of LSU Press. That's the guys in Baton Rouge. And thank you so much for taking the time this evening, Damian.
Thanks a million, Niels. That was a very enjoyable chat. Sorry, I was wandering all over the place, but it was too much fun
It
chatting
was
about it.
good. It was great fun. Thank you.